Absolute power does not corrupt because it reveals the true nature of man. It corrupts because it creates an alternative reality where the human psyche can flourish without restrictions, where every narcissistic impulse finds not only validation, but also the tools to turn whim into law, resentment into a death sentence, and wounded ego into a perfectly lubricated destruction machine. The narcissistic kings of history were not monsters who ascended to the throne. They were architects of such a refined psychological hell that their victims often thanked the torture, so systematic that cruelty became protocol, so normalized that terror became a label. The most disturbing thing is not that these men existed. The most disturbing thing is that the throne awaited them, ready to transform their personal pathologies into state policy. Henry VIII of England embodies this transformation with brutal clarity. When Anne Boleyn, the woman for whom he challenged the Pope and fractured Christendom, ceased to be the mirror reflecting his greatness, Henry did not simply execute her. That would have been too simple, too honest. Instead, he built a psychological degradation theater so elaborate that the final execution was almost mercy. First came the accusation of adultery, not with one, but with 5 men, including her own brother. The specificity was the poison. Henry knew that the human mind cannot defend itself from multiple detailed accusations without appearing desperate. Each denial by Anne sounded like confirmation. Every protest of innocence was reinterpreted as evidence of her cunning. But Enrique's psychological mastery did not lie in the accusation, but in isolation. Ana was separated from her daughter, her family, from anyone who could remind her of who she had been before becoming a receptacle for real projections. In the Tower of London, surrounded by women specifically chosen to report every word, every gesture, every moment of weakness, Ana not only lost her freedom, she lost her reality. Every thought was potentially treason. Every emotion could be used against her. Enrique had turned her mind into a prison more effective than any stone cell. The sadomasochistic brilliance of this method lies in its psychological economy. Henry did not need to torture her physically. The implicit threat of what could happen to his daughter, his family, anyone who had supported her was enough. Anne Boleyn became her own jailer, editing every thought, measuring every word, knowing that the slightest sign of resistance could trigger a cascade of revenge that would destroy not only her, but everyone she loved. And when she was finally executed, Henry demonstrated an additional refinement in his cruelty. He imported a French swordsman, supposedly as an act of mercy, a cleaner death than the English axe. But the true purpose of this gesture was to create a final layer of psychological confusion. Even in her execution, Anne was supposed to feel something akin to gratitude towards her executioner. Enrique had achieved what every pathological narcissist longs for, controlling not only the actions of his victim, but also their final emotions, even infecting the moment of their death with his psychological presence. This pattern repeats with Catalina Howard, his 5th wife, but with even greater sophistication. Enrique had already perfected his method. Catalina was young, barely a teenager, when she married the aging and physically deteriorated king. When rumors of infidelity arose, real or fabricated, Enrique did not act with the impulsive fury one might expect. Instead, he launched a campaign of psychological terror so calculated that it seemed designed by a modern specialist in psychological warfare. First, silence. Catalina was informed of the accusations, but was not allowed to see the king or defend herself. She was placed in a Kafkaesque limbo where she knew her life was in danger, but was given no opportunity to influence her fate. Then came the questioning from everyone in her circle. Each servant, each lady-in-waiting, every person who had shared a private conversation with her. Enrique turned her entire life into evidence, every moment of intimacy into potential betrayal. What made this particularly cruel was that Catalina was genuinely young and naive. Her confessions, extracted under extreme psychological pressure, revealed not so much guilt as confusion, the panic of a young mind trying to understand which answers might save her. Enrique had created a situation where innocence and guilt were indistinguishable, where any answer was the wrong answer. But Enrique's mastery was not unique. It was simply a particularly clear expression of a dynamic that repeats throughout narcissistic power. Ivan the Terrible of Russia took these techniques to a scale and brutality that make Enrique seem almost moderate. When Ivan suspected the city of Novgorod of treason, he did not simply punish it. He orchestrated a month of systematic massacre that was both a psychological spectacle and a genocide. Families were forced to watch the torture of their loved ones before being executed themselves. The city was surrounded so that no one could escape, turning the entire Novgorod into a theater of terror where every inhabitant knew that death was inevitable, but the timing and method were uncertain. This uncertainty was the true instrument of torture. Ivan intuitively understood what modern psychologists would confirm centuries later. The anticipation of pain is often more psychologically destructive than the pain itself. Humans can endure almost any suffering if they have a time frame, a visible end. But when suffering is indefinite, when each moment could be the last or the first of a new phase of agony, the mind begins to break down. What makes Ivan particularly fascinating from a psychological perspective is that he did not try to hide his sadism behind a facade of justice or political necessity. Unlike Enrique, who at least maintained the theater of trials and formal accusations, Ivan was transparent about the fact that his cruelty was personal, emotional, and ultimately arbitrary. This created an even deeper terror. His victims could not even console themselves with the illusion that if they behaved correctly, if they were loyal enough, if they served well enough, they would be safe. Ivan could wake up in a bad mood and decide that a loyal counselor of decades was now a traitor who deserved a terrible death. This complete arbitrariness destroyed any sense of agency or control. In Ivan's world, kindness, loyalty, and competence were irrelevant. The only thing that mattered was the psychological state of the Tsar at a given moment, something over which no one had control. The Oprichnina, Ivan's personal secret police, was the institutionalization of this narcissistic whim. These men, dressed in black and riding black horses, carried symbols of a dog's head and a broom, supposedly to signify their loyalty to the Tsar and their role in sweeping away treason. But the true message was darker. The dog's head meant they were less than human, beasts without free will that existed only to carry out the Tsar's wishes. The broom represented arbitrary cleansing, the fact that anyone, at any moment, could be designated as dirt that needed sweeping. The members of the Oprichnina not only carried out Ivan's violence, they amplified it. They knew that their position depended on constantly demonstrating their usefulness, which meant constantly finding new victims, new conspiracies, new betrayals. Ivan had created a system that generated its own justification, where the apparatus of terror needed to feed constantly to prove its necessity. This self-perpetuating mechanism is where individual narcissism becomes something more dangerous, a system that transcends any individual. Nero of Rome took this to its logical conclusion. When a fire devastated Rome in 64 AD, Nero saw not a tragedy, but an opportunity. The accusations that he himself had started the fire to rebuild Rome according to his megalomaniacal vision were probably true, but that is almost irrelevant. What matters is how Nero responded to these accusations. Instead of defending himself, he created a scapegoat: the Christians. This was not a religious persecution in the modern sense. It was a theater of cruelty, specifically designed to redirect public rage and simultaneously satisfy Nero's sadistic impulses. Christians were executed in ways meant for public spectacle. They were covered with animal skins and torn apart by dogs, crucified and burned alive as human torches to light Nero's gardens during his nighttime festivities. Each execution was a theatrical performance where Nero was the director, the audience, and the critic. What makes this particularly disturbing is that it worked. The population of Rome, traumatized by the fire and desperately seeking someone to blame, accepted Nero's narrative. Christians became monsters in the popular imagination, enemies of Rome, who deserved any suffering inflicted upon them. Nero had achieved something that all pathological narcissists pursue: redefining reality itself. Cruelty was no longer cruelty. it was justice. Sadism was no longer sadism, it was political necessity. And anyone questioning this new reality risked being categorized as an enemy. This is the ultimate terror of narcissistic power. It not only punishes dissent, but makes dissent psychologically impossible. Questioning Nero was questioning the safety of Rome, the legitimacy of the social order, the very distinction between good and evil. Nero had turned his personal pathology into the cosmology of the empire. But there is an even darker aspect of this dynamic that these historical examples are only beginning to reveal. The true evil genius of narcissistic power is not the violence it inflicts, but the violence it causes its victims to inflict upon themselves. Caligula of Rome understood this with a clarity that remains disturbing 2 millennia later. His most notorious acts, such as appointing his horse Incitatus as consul or declaring himself a living god, are often interpreted as signs of madness. But they were something more calculated, reality tests designed to measure how far he could twist the perception of those around him. When Caligula insisted that the Senate treat his horse as a colleague, he was not merely humiliating the senators. He was forcing them to actively participate in their own degradation, to publicly defend something they knew was absurd, to train their minds to accept the unacceptable. Every senator who went along with this farce became less capable of resisting the next transgression, the next impossibility. Caligula was not only breaking their dignity, he was breaking their ability to recognize where their dignity should lie. This technique of forcing active participation in one's own humiliation is perhaps the most sophisticated tool in the narcissist with power's arsenal. It is not enough for victims to suffer. They must be accomplices in their suffering. They must say the words that condemn them, sign the documents that destroy them, smile while their own gallows are being built. This creates a psychological trap from which it is almost impossible to escape. Once you have participated in your own degradation, cognitive dissonance does the rest of the work. The human mind cannot easily tolerate the idea that it has betrayed its own values, so it begins to reinterpret those values. Perhaps dignity was not so important. Perhaps resistance was truly impossible. Perhaps the narcissist was right all along. This rationalization is the ultimate triumph of narcissistic power. It no longer needs to force compliance because its victims now force themselves. The psychological mechanisms that these kings instinctively exploited have been studied and named by modern psychology, but this does not make them less effective. The traumatic bond, where victims of abuse develop paradoxical emotional attachments to their abusers, is not a weakness or a pathology. It is a survival response. When someone has absolute power over your life and can alternate between cruelty and mercy unpredictably, your brain begins to desperately seek patterns, trying to find the rules that will keep you safe. And when the abuser occasionally shows kindness or simply temporarily withdraws the threat, the relief is so intense that it feels like love. Narcissistic kings understood this intuitively. Henry VIII alternated between extravagant affection and cold cruelty. Ivan the Terrible could cry in remorse for his victims one day and order new atrocities the next. This inconsistency was not a failure in his psychological control. It was his essence. He kept everyone in a state of hypervigilance, always trying to guess which version of the king they would find, always adjusting their behavior to maximize the chances of finding the kind king rather than the monster. Learned helplessness, the phenomenon where victims of chronic abuse stop trying to escape even when escape becomes possible, was another tool in their unconscious arsenal. When every attempt at resistance is punished, when every display of autonomy is crushed, when every hope is systematically destroyed, the mind eventually stops generating hope. This is not cowardice. It is a rational adaptation to an impossible reality. The courtiers of these kings often had opportunities to escape, to flee, to conspire. But after years of conditioning, the very idea of resistance became psychologically impossible. It was not that they could not imagine freedom. It was that they could no longer imagine that freedom was possible for them. They had become perfect prisoners, people who would keep the chains in place even if the jailer removed them. And then there is normalization. perhaps the most insidious effect of all. When cruelty is constant, when terror is routine, when humiliation is daily, something strange happens in the human psyche. The abnormal becomes normal. The intolerable becomes tolerable. Not because the victims become stronger or more resilient, but because redefining normal is the only way the mind can maintain its sanity. Ivan's courtiers learned to discuss the weather while watching tortures. Nero's advisors learned to plan politics while the emperor organized atrocities for his entertainment. This normalization created an alternative reality where the impossible was simply how things are. And once you reach that point, once you have accepted the unacceptable as the backdrop of reality, there is no line the narcissist cannot cross. Each new transgression simply expands the definition of normal a little more. But here is the truly terrifying part. These are not just historical phenomena, relics of more brutal eras. The psychological mechanisms that these kings exploited are still exactly the same in the modern human brain. The only difference is the context. The modern narcissist does not need the power of life and death over their victims. Economic, social, and emotional power is enough. A boss can create the same cycle of hope and despair as Henry VIII, alternating between praise and humiliation until employees begin to measure their worth by their reactions. A partner can deploy the same isolation that turned Anne Boleyn's mind into a prison, systematically distancing someone from their support networks until the abuser becomes their only reality. A charismatic leader can create the same normalization that made the Romans accept Nero's atrocities, slowly redefining what behaviors are acceptable until the unthinkable becomes routine. The difference is in scale, not in type. The CEO, who systematically destroys his employees' confidence in their own competence, is using the same technique as Ivan when he turned loyalty into a meaningless category. The politician, who builds his power base on demonizing an external group, is drawing from the same manual as Nero when he created Christians as scapegoats. The emotional manipulator, who makes his partner question their own perception of reality, is using the same tool as Caligula when he forced the Senate to treat his horse as an equal. The mechanisms are universal because human psychology is universal. What changes is simply how much power the narcissist has to implement these mechanisms, how far they can go with torture before external forces intervene. And this is where the story of narcissistic kings becomes truly relevant to the modern world. It is not a warning about distant tyrants. It is a map of how psychological abuse works on any scale. Every technique that Henry, Ivan, or Nero used, every psychological mechanism they exploited, is available in miniature for anyone with a power imbalance and a narcissistic pathology. The pattern is always the same. First comes isolation, separating the victim from any alternative reality. Then comes redefinition, slowly altering the victim's perception of what is normal, acceptable, tolerable. Next comes forced participation, making the victim an accomplice to their own destruction. And finally, normalization, where the victim can no longer imagine that things could be different. This is not a process that requires an army or a crown. It only requires differential power and the will to exploit it without moral limits. The narcissistic kings of history were not aberrations. They were pure expressions of a dynamic that exists wherever power is concentrated and empathy is absent. They were inadvertent teachers, leaving behind a complete curriculum on how to systematically destroy a human psyche. And the most disturbing thing is that their methods work not because they are particularly complex or require special intelligence. They work because they are perfectly calibrated to exploit vulnerabilities inherent in human cognition. The need to predict the future, the search for patterns, the impulse to rationalize one's own behavior, the capacity to gradually normalize the abnormal. These are not weaknesses. They are characteristics of the human brain, adaptations that generally serve us well. But in the hands of a narcissist with power, they become vectors of infection, entry points for a control system that can turn even the strongest person into their own jailer. The final lesson of narcissistic kings is not that power corrupts. That is too simple, too comforting in its implication that the problem is power itself. The real lesson is that certain types of personalities, when combined with unlimited power, create predictable machines of psychological destruction. Not because they are crazy or monsters, but precisely because they are human. Humans with a particular configuration of psychological needs and an almost complete absence of the normal restrictions that keep those needs in check. The pathological narcissist needs constant validation, but no amount of validation is enough because the need arises from an internal void that cannot be filled from the outside. They need total control over how others perceive them, but the reality of other people's individuality always threatens that control. They need to demonstrate their superiority, but any evidence of others' competence or worth challenges that superiority. These contradictory and impossible to satisfy needs create a perpetual engine of cruelty. No matter how many people they destroy, no matter how absolutely they control their environment, the internal emptiness remains. And so, the destruction continues, not toward any real goal, but simply because the psychological machine cannot stop. Henry VIII found no peace after Anne Boleyn. He continued marrying, destroying, and discarding until his death. Ivan the Terrible killed his own son in a fit of rage and spent the rest of his life oscillating between paralyzing remorse and new violence. Nero ultimately committed suicide when his empire rejected him, but not before destroying countless lives in his quest for validation. Caligula was assassinated by his own guard, tired of his capricious cruelty. None of them achieved what they sought because what they sought was psychologically impossible. They were not trying to achieve political goals or build lasting legacies. They were trying to use external power to resolve internal voids, to force the world to fill a space that cannot be filled from the outside. And in that impossible attempt, they created an incalculable misery, not out of pure malice, but due to a pathology that unlimited power transformed from a personal dysfunction into a state policy. This raises a final and uncomfortable question. How much of this dynamic is present in power structures that we consider normal, acceptable, even necessary? How much of the behavior we tolerate in leaders, bosses, authority figures is simply a diluted version of what these kings did without restrictions? The difference between Henry VIII and the CEO who rules through fear may be a matter of degree, not type. The difference between Ivan the Terrible and the manipulator who controls his family through anxiety may simply be a matter of scale. The mechanisms are the same. The psychology is the same. Only the scope of power varies. And if that is true, then the story of narcissistic kings is not history at all. It is an operations manual, a foundational text that explains something that is still happening every day in offices, homes, and institutions around the world. But now it happens with enough subtlety, with enough plausible denial, that we can pretend it is something different. The narcissistic kings taught us that psychological destruction does not require supernatural monsters. It simply requires particular personality configurations, power imbalances, and the absence of effective restraints. They taught us that the most dangerous people are not necessarily the most violent, but those who can make violence seem normal, necessary, even virtuous. They taught us that the most effective psychological abuse is not the one that clearly breaks its victims, but the one that turns them into voluntary participants in their own destruction. They taught us that power without empathy creates systems that perpetuate themselves, where each act of cruelty creates the conditions for the next. And perhaps most importantly, they taught us that these dynamics are not relics of barbaric eras. They're permanent possibilities of the human condition, always present wherever power is concentrated and institutional controls are weak. What remains is a question that each person must answer for themselves. In your own life, in the power structures you inhabit or serve, how much of this dynamic is present? How much of your normality is normalization? How many times have you participated in your own degradation and then rationalized that there was no alternative? How many times have you seen others subjected to this process and decided that it was not your problem? Narcissistic kings are dead, but the psychological architecture they built remains alive, waiting for anyone with the power to implement it and the will to do so. The question is not whether these dynamics exist. The question is how much of your life is already being lived within them, and what you would do if you finally saw the bars of the cage you have learned to call freedom.